Hong Kong has been called a pearl in the ear of old China. It's also been called a beggar on the doorstep for the largest communist country in the world. The words Hong Kong mean fragrant harbor. As soon as you land here, you realize that you've entered a very watery world, a world of islands and boats. The little boat there is called a sampan, and these are the water taxis that transport people all over this area. They have so much water around here that they probably have as many water taxis as the four-wheel kind. Many people here live a floating existence. They live on these large boats, and the little sampans provide transportation between them. Hong Kong is the most densely populated island in the world. It's also a place where the old world and the new come together. The romantic old Star Ferry can get you across Victoria Harbor to Hong Kong Island. Please do not spit. They don't want you spitting on the Star Ferry. They also have one of the most modern and efficient subway systems anywhere in the world. It's another way to get from the Kowloon Peninsula where you land, under Victoria Harbor, out to Hong Kong Island. You can be in many parts of downtown Hong Kong, and you might feel as though you're in San Francisco or London or any other international city. That's until you look up one of the windy little roads in the old Wan Chai district. You can see the way Hong Kong has looked for about a century. The most densely populated place in the world. On Hong Kong Island and the neighboring communities, 6 million people live together in these tiny pieces of land. This is the old Wan Chai district, the oldest part of town. It's also the Suzy Wong district of 1940s and 50s fame. When you first arrive here, the hustle and bustle and the human energy is a little bit intimidating at first until you get used to the crowds. Here's the future, not only for Hong Kong, but many of the other places out here. Education. You can always see school children coming and going from school in uniform. Due to their modern advancements in technology, places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan have really taken the business world by storm in the last few decades. So now you have some of the wealthiest people in the world living side by side with some of the poorest on this tiny speck of land. Hong Kong is a land of diversity. And China is a land of harsh realities. I'm going to show you a few things that might shock you, like this. But no sooner will you see something like that, you'll turn your head and see something else that will enchant you. It all just goes with the neighborhood. You're also going to see some of the cutest children you've ever seen in your life. China's full of them. There are more Chinese in the world than anybody else. And the power and energy that runs this whole place is the almighty dollar. I've never seen such money-conscious people in my life. Here's a look back into the past, little rickshaws that used to transport people around. Today, the rickshaw drivers prefer to nap in the sun, maybe have their picture taken with you. If you pay one of them enough, he'll huff and puff you down around the business central district of Hong Kong. This is no longer a cost-effective way to travel. They cost more than the taxis. But it's worth at least one ride to see what it must have felt like in the old days. This is downtown central Hong Kong, the business center. It's also the first part of Hong Kong that was settled by the British back in the early 1840s. Nobody really lives downtown. It's for business only. Most people live in the surrounding areas. And most of them live in public housing. Hong Kong has the largest and most successful public housing project to be found anywhere in the world. Of the 6 million people that live here, fully 1/2 of them live in some kind of government-subsidized public housing. Everything that you're looking at is public housing. That's how you get 6 million people in such a small place. And about 150 years ago, it looked like this. They said that Hong Kong was a barren rock without a human structure on it, but it was very attractive to the British. The British needed a colony, a seaport out here where they could trade with the Chinese and get out from under the very expensive trade rules of the Hussongs. Hong Kong foot the bill. So a community sprung up here in one season. There was a tenuous relationship between the British and the Chinese in the beginning. The British didn't really like Hong Kong Island. There was nothing on it. Now, what they wanted was Victoria Harbor. If you notice, Victoria Harbor has a very unique S shape. That means if you're anchored in a ship in the center of that harbor, you're protected on all four sides by land, protected from the terrible typhoons that rage through this part of the world every year. It was the most perfectly shaped natural harbor in Asia, and the British wanted it. And they acquired it through some very unorthodox methods. It was tough in the early days. For example, disease was quite a problem. Back then, they believed that malaria was caused by poison gases that were released from certain parts of the earth in the summertime. As we know today, malaria is actually carried by certain varieties of mosquito. But they didn't know that back then. In that first season, the malaria epidemic decimated the ranks of the British Navy and the Hong Kong population. Yeah, life in old Hong Kong was tough, but not as tough as it was up in the Chinese mainland. Disease, starvation, bandits, pirates, civil war were all very common up here. And the punishments for crimes were horrendous. This was one of the punishments for piracy. And this was a punishment for smuggling. And you were never released here. You stayed in this contraption until you died. These factors, among many others, caused the first big wave of human population heading south for the more lenient rule of the British in Hong Kong. Some of the wealthy Chinese came too, with some interesting customs. For example, an upper-class woman had to have a foot-binding ceremony when she was a teenager. A bandage that was 1 inch wide and 12 feet long was wrapped around the heel, over the instep, and up under the arch of the foot, pulling the toes closer to the heel, creating a 4-inch long foot for a fully grown woman. Painful for the rest of her life, but necessary if she was in the upper class. These customs were appalling to the British when they arrived here, but no more appalling than the British customs were to the Chinese. For example, the British introduced opium here for the purposes of trade, and in a short period of time they were addicting the population of southern China to this drug. The British were bringing the opium in under the protection of the British Navy. And over the years, through the opium trade, they managed to acquire Hong Kong Island, the neighboring islands, and finally the new territories here in light green, all on the south coast of China. Now, why opium? Well, the British needed tea, silk, and porcelain from the Chinese. The only thing that the Chinese would accept for these goods was silver bullion. And even though a few British merchants were becoming very wealthy, they were bankrupting the British economy. They needed a new product. That product turned out to be opium. They could harvest these opium poppies in India through their Dutch East India Company, take the opium to Hong Kong, sell it for silver bullion, buy the tea, silk, and porcelain, and take the goods back to England, then back to India for more opium. This triangular trade route was established, and vast fortunes were amassed in a short period of time. But as I said, they were addicting the population of the southern part of this country to this drug. This was a romantic time in history, though, the time of the Taipan traders, when swift China clipper ships like this one would make the race from Hong Kong to England. The company owning the ships that arrived first would get the best prices for their goods. This is also the subject of James Clavell's novel, Taipan. Well, today Hong Kong has 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the present, and both eyes on the future. Like at Aberdeen Fishing Village on the south coast of Hong Kong. Aberdeen is a fascinating world within a world, an entire floating community. The people live here on the large junks, and the little sampans provide transportation. Well, about 150 years ago, the Chinese emperor decided that this addiction of his people to opium had to end. So they had sort of a Boston Tea Party of their own. The Chinese threw a fortune worth of British opium overboard, costing the Taipans a fortune and infuriating the British government, which immediately declared war on China. They called this the First Opium War. It lasted for about 2 weeks, and the British easily won the war. They demanded Hong Kong Island in war reparations. Then 20 years later, they had the Second Opium War for exactly the same reason with exactly the same results. This time, the British demanded the neighboring islands. But then 30 years later, they had another treaty, this time without a war, and the Chinese did better for themselves this time. They actually gave a large expanse of land called the New Territories to the British, but on a 99-year lease. Well, July 1st, 1997, the lease expired, and the People's Republic of China regained custody of Hong Kong, the neighboring islands, and everything out here. The opium trade still exists, but it no longer comes from India nor through the British. Now the opium comes from the steaming jungles of the Golden Triangle, where Thailand, Laos, and Burma all come together. The opium is grown by the villagers up here and controlled by the mercenary armies and their warlords. The opium is harvested up here every winter and carried down out of these mountains in mule trains. A few weeks later, the opium will be entering harbors all over Southeast Asia. Aberdeen is one of them. But Aberdeen is also one of the most popular tourist attractions on Hong Kong Island. Every day, people from all over the world will come out here to take a sampan ride out among the floating community of Aberdeen. This is also some vintage footage. This was shot more than 20 years ago. Aberdeen has changed a little bit in these days. Unfortunately, in my opinion, they cleaned it up a little bit. It lost some of its magic and charm. Back at this time, some of the elderly people here never touched dry land their entire lives. They lived their lives floating on the junks due to an ancient feud between the Chinese emperor and the rulers of the sea. What in many parts of the world is considered to be superstition, in China is often considered to be religion. They have fortune tellers in all the temples, and they believe that there's a spirit in almost everything. The mountains, the trees, the rocks, the sea, everything has a spirit, even wood. So the builders here won't touch metal scaffolding. They feel that if they tie their bamboo scaffolding together like this, that spirit will save a life, as long as they don't put any nails into the wood. If anybody falls, there will always be a piece of bamboo to reach out and grab, thanks to that spirit. So everything is tied together. And no matter how tall the buildings or signs are, they look like this when they're going up.